Hello. Welcome to Phantom Homicide, the murder of Kitty Genovese and the myth of 38 witnesses. Kitty Genovese, just hearing the name for so many people, it brings up this one incredibly stark image, doesn't it? A young woman screaming for help in the dead of night,
Mm-hmm.
and supposedly 38 neighbors just watching from their windows, doing nothing. That single detail, I mean, whether it was fact or not, it wasn't just a news item. It became this cornerstone story in American history, a kind of dark parable about how cold and anonymous big cities had become by the 1960s.
Yeah, a parable of apathy, really, moral failure on a massive scale.
Exactly. So tonight we're going back to Kew Gardens, Queens, March 13th, 1964. It's a story that honestly has haunted New York and, well, shaped psychology for, what, 60 years now?
It really has. And that image you mentioned, the 38 silent watchers, that's precisely why we need to dig into this. Because,
Right.
our mission here isn't just recounting the horrific crime itself, although we will. It's more about dissecting how a story, a media report that we now know was, frankly, deeply inaccurate and sensationalized, became such a powerful, persistent urban myth. We've got some incredible sources, investigative work, journalistic retractions years later, psychological studies.
Okay.
And the goal is to really painstakingly unpack what actually happened during those terrible 30 minutes. Why did that false story, that narrative of apathy, take such a deep root in our collective consciousness? And, beyond the myth, what did the case truly teach us or change in society?
So we're peeling back the layers,
Mm-hmm.
the myth versus the reality. And I think the theme here is how this simplified, flawed account just took over. It became the case study for human failure, didn't it?
Absolutely. Foundational.
And in doing so, it almost erased the real person, the actual tragic story of Kitty Genovese, this 28-year-old woman whose life was just brutally stolen.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, we have to start with her. Let's try and reclaim Kitty's story from the legend. Okay, so Catherine Susan Genovese, everyone called her Kitty.
Yeah.
Born in Brooklyn, 1935. Italian-American family, Catholic upbringing, the eldest of 5 kids.
Mm-hmm.
And sources say she had that sort of determination that often comes with being the oldest. Described as really vibrant, talkative, someone with a sunny disposition. And she wasn't just drifting. She had plans, big plans.
She definitely did. At 28, she was already a bar manager, Ev's 11th Hour Bar in Hollis, Queens. And she was working incredibly hard, like punishing double shifts sometimes.
Wow.
Yeah, closing the bar late, then maybe back again the next morning. All because she was saving money, relentlessly saving, with a very specific dream, opening her own Italian restaurant.
So this was serious ambition.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. This was a calculated goal. And, alongside that drive, she was also navigating her personal life, which really speaks to how self-assured she must have been, especially for that era. She'd been married briefly in 1954, but that was annulled
Okay.
because Kitty was a lesbian. And since 1963, she'd been living there in Kew Gardens with her girlfriend, Marianne Zilanko. This was, understandably, a very private part of her life back then. You have to remember the intense social and legal stigma around same-sex relationships in 1964.
Right, of course. So you have this picture of a determined, ambitious young woman working late, heading home. And then there's the other side of the story, the killer, Winston Moseley.
Yeah. The shadow, as you put it. Moseley was 29, lived in Manhattan, married, had 3 kids. His job was, well, pretty mundane on the surface. He was a tab operator for Remington Rand.
Like early computers, punch cards.
Exactly. Data input stuff. But behind that ordinary facade was something truly terrifying. A predator. When he was eventually caught, he gave this motive, and it's just bone-chilling. He said he went out that night simply to kill a woman.
Just like that.
Just like that. Because in his warped thinking, they were easier and didn't fight back. He'd actually left his wife at home. She was a nurse working a night shift, ironically, and just drove around Queens after 2 a.m., actively hunting for someone.
God. Okay, so this is where the timeline gets critical and really horrifying. It's dark, it's late. Moseley has his hunting knife. He's ready. Kitty leaves the bar, probably around 2:30 a.m.
That's right. And somewhere around Hoover Avenue, stopped at a light, Moseley spots her white Corvair. He starts following her. She pulls into her usual spot around 3:45 a.m. in the Long Island Railroad parking lot, about 100 feet from her apartment building's entrance.
So close to safety.
Agonizingly close. Moseley parks his own car, a white Chevy Corvair, at a nearby bus stop. Gets out quickly. Kitty must have seen him coming, or sensed something was wrong. As she hurried towards the building entrance, he ran up behind her.
And that's the first attack.
Yes, he stabbed her twice in the back. One of those wounds immediately punctured her lung.
And she screamed. That's when the first screams were heard.
Exactly. She cried, "Oh my God, he stabbed me, help me." And this is crucial, host speaker, because this moment right here is where the myth of total silence, total apathy starts to fall apart when you look at the facts.
Because people did hear something.
Several people heard that scream, and importantly, one neighbor, a man named Robert Moser, actually reacted. He shouted down from his window something like, "Let that girl alone."
So there was an intervention, however brief.
A direct verbal intervention. And it worked for a moment. Mosley was startled, spooked. He actually ran back to his car and drove off. This is key. The attack wasn't one continuous event that everyone watched unfold for half an hour. There was a break. Witnesses saw him leave.
Okay, so Mosley drives off. But Kitty is already badly wounded.
Terribly wounded. She manages to stagger away from the parking lot area towards the back entrance of her apartment building, out of sight from those initial witnesses near the street.
But Mosley wasn't gone for good.
No, he was determined. He drove around the block, waited maybe 10 minutes for things to quiet down, pulled a wide-brimmed hat down to shadow his face, and came back on foot.
Looking for her.
Systematically searching. He checked the parking lot, the walkways, the apartment building entrances. He realized she couldn't have gotten far. And eventually, he found her. Collapsed, barely conscious, in a hallway vestibule at the rear of the building.
A locked door stopped her.
Yes, a locked door at the back of that hallway. She couldn't get any further. And crucially, this location was completely hidden from the street, hidden from most of the apartment windows that faced the front.
And that's where he attacked her again.
That's where the second and fatal assault took place. It was brutal. He stabbed her several more times. The autopsy later showed, I think, 13 stab wounds in total. He then raped her and stole the $49 she had in her wallet.
Could she fight back at all then?
The evidence suggests she did. There were defensive wounds, knife cuts found on her hands, so even in that horrific state, she was fighting for her life. The entire ordeal, from the first stab to Mosley finally leaving after the second assault, likely spanned about half an hour, including that 10-minute gap.
And after Mosley finally left for good.
That's when Sophia Farrar comes into the story. A neighbor, but also, importantly, a close friend of Kitty's. She was one of the people who had heard the commotion earlier. After things went quiet again, she bravely ventured out.
She went to Kitty.
Yes. She found Kitty lying in that hallway, barely alive, and she cradled her. Sources say she whispered, "Help is on the way."
That act of compassion or friendship, that gets lost in the 38 witnesses story, doesn't it?
Completely overshadowed. An ambulance was called, finally arrived around 4:15 a.m., but Kitty died on the way to the hospital. The primary cause of death, according to the coroner, was asphyxiation suffocation because of that punctured lung from the very first stab wound.
And the police response back then, it wasn't like dialing 911 today, right?
Not at all. That's a critical piece of context. The 911 system didn't exist in New York City until 1968, 4 years later. In 64, you called the local precinct, or maybe the operator. Calls weren't centrally dispatched or prioritized in the same way.
So even if someone called,
it might not have triggered an urgent response.
There.
We know at least one witness's father did call police after the first attack. He reported seeing a woman beat up but got up and was staggering around. The police logged it, but likely treated it as a lower priority disturbance, maybe a resolved fight, especially since Mosley had initially driven off. That lack of a standardized emergency system was a major factor in the delayed response.
Given the absolute horror of what happened, you'd think it would be immediate banner headlines. But it wasn't, was it? The story barely made a ripple at first.
Shockingly quiet. There was just a tiny blurb, maybe a few paragraphs, buried inside the New York Times on March 14th, the day after. That was it.
So what changed? How did it explode 2 weeks later?
It all came down to one conversation, really. A lunch meeting between the Times Metropolitan editor, Abe Rosenthal, and the NYC police commissioner at the time, Michael J. Murphy.
Okay.
Rosenthal later wrote about this. Murphy apparently told him offhand, remarking on the Genovese case, that Queen's story is one for the books. He was reportedly disturbed by what his investigators were telling him, that numerous neighbors had apparently heard or seen something and failed to call the police.
And Rosenthal, he smelled a story. A big one.
Oh, absolutely. He saw the potential for a major piece, something that spoke to the anxieties of the time. He assigned a reporter, Martin Gansberg, to dig into it. And Gansberg's article, published March 27, 1964, that was the spark that lit the fire. The headline alone was explosive. 37 who saw a murder didn't call the police.
Wait, 37? I thought it was 38.
Yeah, it's interesting. The number shifted slightly, almost immediately. Gansberg's article said 37, but it quickly morphed into the slightly rounder, maybe more memorable 38 in subsequent discussions and retellings. But either way, that number became legendary overnight.
And the article itself, what made it so powerful?
It perfectly captured this growing fear about urban life in the 60s. The sense of alienation, the breakdown of community, the idea that cities made people cold and indifferent. And it crystallized all that anxiety around one single devastating quote attributed to an unnamed neighbor who supposedly hesitated before calling anyone.
A famous quote.
I didn't want to get involved. That line became the epitaph for Kitty Genovese and the indictment of an entire city, an entire era.
Wow. Just that one line encapsulated everything.
It really did. The story went viral, 1960s style. Editorials, sermons, water cooler talk, eventually psychology textbooks. It struck a raw nerve. It seemed to offer a simple, terrifying explanation for a senseless murder. People just didn't care anymore.
And the details got more lurid over time, didn't they? Like adding fuel to the fire.
Oh, definitely. Sensationalism took over. There's that famous or infamous anecdote that got picked up everywhere, often attributed to the sci-fi writer Harlan Ellison. He claimed one witness, a man watching from his window, actually turned up his radio so he wouldn't have to hear Kitty's screams.
Is there any proof that actually happened?
No definitive proof at all. It might have been speculation or rumor or just an embellishment that fit the narrative. But true or not, it became part of the legend, painting the witnesses not just as passive, but as actively, cruelly indifferent.
It's like the narrative created its own reality.
In a way, yes. Sources mention this became a recurring theme. There was another Times article in 1974, 10 years after Kitty's murder, about another murder victim, Sandra Zoller, killed in a nearby building overlooking the Genovese site.
Oh, wow.
And the reporting again emphasized neighbors hearing screams and struggles, but allegedly doing nothing. It reinforced the idea that Kew Gardens, and by extension all big cities, were just places where people let neighbors die. The apathy narrative was almost expected by then.
And the number itself, 37 or 38, where did that actually come from? Was it just made up?
Well, later investigations tried to piece it together. The initial police probe involved interviewing maybe up to 49 people, but that included multiple people in the same household, people who heard vague noises, people who saw nothing relevant. The best guess seems to be that someone in the police department, maybe a harried civil servant, as one source put it, gave Commissioner Murphy a rough estimate of potential witnesses or people interviewed.
An approximation.
Yeah, an approximation that likely got simplified, then maybe rounded up slightly by Rosenthal or Gansberg for dramatic effect. And boom, 38 witnesses became historical fact, embedded in the public mind.
Okay, so while the media storm was brewing around the 38 witnesses, the police were actually closing in on the real killer. And the way they caught Mosley, just 6 days after the murder, on March 19th, it actually contradicts that whole apathy narrative, doesn't it?
It really does. It happened miles away. In Ozone Park, Mosley was caught red-handed during a burglary. He was carrying a television out of a house.
And someone saw him?
Yes, a neighbor, Raul Cleary. Cleary thought Mosley looked suspicious, challenged him. Mosley tried to bluff, claiming he was a mover. Cleary didn't buy it. He didn't just shrug and walk away. He talked to another neighbor, Jack Brown. Cleary called the police.
And Brown did something, too.
Yeah, Jack Brown actually went and disabled Mosley's car so he couldn't drive off before the cops arrived. Think about that active suspicion, communication between neighbors, decisive action to detain a suspect. It's a polar opposite of the Kew Gardens myth.
Direct intervention. So the police arrive.
They arrest Mosley for the burglary. But then, a detective working the Genovese case noticed something crucial. Mosley's car, that white Chevrolet Corvair, matched the description given by some of the witnesses back in Kew Gardens who saw the car leaving the scene.
Ah, the connection.
That was the link. They started questioning Mosley about the murder, and under questioning, he cracked. He confessed, not just to killing Kitty Genovese, providing details only the killer would know.
But to other crimes as well.
Yes. He confessed to murdering 2 other women, Annie Mae Johnson, who had been found shot and her body burned, and a 15-year-old girl named Barbara Kralik. Plus, he admitted to maybe 30 or 40 burglaries over time.
Good Lord. So he wasn't just a random attacker. He was a serial killer.
A serial killer and burglar. And the psychiatric evaluations done after his arrest painted an even darker picture. They suggested necrophilia might have been part of his pathology. This wasn't just a robbery gone wrong. This was deeply predatory sexual violence.
But he was only tried for Kitty's murder. Why not the others?
It got complicated. In the Barbara Kralik case, another man, Alvin Mitchell, had also confessed to her murder. So, to avoid muddying the waters or potential legal challenges, the prosecution focused solely on the Genovese case, where the evidence against Mosley was strongest.
Okay, so the trial, he pleaded not guilty initially.
Yes, though his defense later shifted to not guilty by reason of insanity. The trial was overseen by Judge J. Irwin Shapiro, and it moved relatively quickly. The jury deliberated for about 7 hours.
And the verdict.
Guilty, found guilty on June 11th, 1964. The sentencing hearing a few days later, June 15th, was apparently quite dramatic.
How so?
Mosley was sentenced to death in the electric chair, and reports say the courtroom, packed with spectators, actually burst into applause and cheers when the sentence was read.
Wow. Intense public reaction.
Extremely. Even Judge Shapiro made this incredible comment from the bench. He said something like, "I don't believe in capital punishment, but when I see a monster like this, I wouldn't hesitate to pull the switch myself." It just shows the level of revulsion Mosley evoked.
But he wasn't executed, was he? The sentence was changed later.
That's right. In 1967, the New York Court of Appeals overturned the death sentence and commuted it to life imprisonment. The legal reasoning was a bit technical.
How did that work?
The appeals court found that while Mosley had been found legally sane at the trial phase, meaning he understood the charges and could participate in his defense, he should have been allowed to argue that he was medically insane during the sentencing phase, potentially mitigating his culpability for the death penalty. It was a distinction between legal competence and underlying mental state that was significant in capital cases back then, so his life was spared.
Life in prison. But that wasn't the end of his violence, was it? He escaped.
He did. In 1968, it was almost unbelievable. He was being transported back from a hospital in Buffalo. He'd apparently injured himself, maybe deliberately, and he managed to overpower a guard, steal his gun, and escape.
And then?
He made his way to a nearby house, which happened to be empty but owned by a couple named Kulaga. When Mr. and Mrs. Kulaga showed up later to check on the property, Mosley took them hostage.
Oh, no.
It was horrific. He tied up Mr. Kulaga, held them for hours, and repeatedly raped Mrs. Kulaga before finally stealing their car and fleeing. Thankfully, he was recaptured fairly quickly after a standoff.
Some more charges, more prison time.
Exactly. He got 2 more 15-year sentences for the escape and the crimes committed during it to run concurrently with his life sentence. And, his time inside wasn't quiet either. He was involved in the huge Attica prison riot in 1971. But, bizarrely, he also managed to earn a bachelor's degree in sociology while incarcerated.
Sociology. The irony. What about parole? Did he ever show remorse?
He came up for parole many, many times over the decades, denied every single time, 18 times in total, I believe, the last denial being in 2015. And his attitude at those hearings, it was just astounding. Utter lack of remorse.
How so?
He seemed to genuinely see himself as the victim. At his first parole hearing in 1984, he actually argued that his notoriety, the fame from the case, made his suffering worse than his victims. He said something truly unbelievable to the board, like, "For a victim outside, it's a one-time or 1 hour or 1 minute affair, but for the person who's caught, it's forever."
That's breathtakingly narcissistic.
Isn't it? He tried to frame the Genovese murder as just a mugging where things got out of hand, claiming he never intended to kill her. Just zero accountability, zero empathy right to the end. He died in prison in 2016 at the age of 81 after serving 52 years.
So while Mosley is living out this dark life in prison, the story of Kitty Genovese, or rather the myth of the 38 witnesses, takes on this whole other life in the world of psychology. It became the classic case study, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely seminal. For decades, probably 4 decades straight, virtually every introductory psychology textbook in the US and the UK used the Kitty Genovese case to illustrate the concept of bystander inaction. It was presented as the definitive example of people failing to help in an emergency.
Even though the foundational story, the 38 witnesses watching the whole thing, was inaccurate.
Exactly. The research was spurred by the parable, by the media narrative, not necessarily by the nuanced, messy reality of what actually happened that night, but it led to some incredibly important work.
This is where the bystander effect comes in, or Genovese syndrome.
Precisely. Social psychologists John Darley and Bibb Latané were pioneers here. Starting with their studies published around 1968, they systematically investigated why people are often less likely to help when others are present. They coined the term bystander effect.
Okay, so what do they find? Why do more people sometimes mean less help?
They broke it down into a few key psychological mechanisms that often work together. The most famous one is probably diffusion of responsibility.
Meaning?
Well, if you're the only person witnessing an emergency, 100% of the responsibility to do something falls on you. But if you think there are, say, 37 other people watching,
You figure someone else will handle it.
exactly. The perceived responsibility gets divided. You assume someone else has already called the police, or someone else is more qualified to intervene, or someone else will step up. So your personal sense of obligation just diffuses. It weakens significantly.
Okay, that makes sense. What else?
The second mechanism is social influence. This is about how we interpret ambiguous situations.
Hmm.
Hearing a scream in the night, is it a real attack? A drunken fight? Kids messing around? We look to others for cues.
So if everyone else looks calm,
If nobody else seems panicked or is reacting, you interpret their inaction as evidence that it must not be a real emergency. Everyone is silently watching everyone else, and this collective non-reaction reinforces the idea that maybe intervention isn't needed. It creates a kind of group paralysis or pluralistic ignorance.
and that ties into what some Kew Gardens residents reportedly thought. Right.
Yeah.
Assuming it was a domestic dispute.
Yes, that's a prime example of social influence defining the situation. Oh, it's probably just a couple fighting, which tragically often meant not my business back then.
Okay, so diffusion of responsibility, social influence.
Mhm.
Was there a third factor?
Yes, audience inhibition. This is basically the fear of looking foolish, fear of embarrassment.
How does that play in?
Imagine you rush out dramatically to save someone, only to find out it was a loud but harmless argument, or you misinterpreted the situation entirely. The potential social awkwardness, the fear of being judged for overreacting, can actually stop you from acting, even if you suspect something is wrong.
So those three things together, thinking someone else will act, looking to others who are doing nothing and fearing embarrassment, they create this bystander effect.
That's the core of Darley and Latania's model, yes.
What's truly disturbing, though, is that Mosley himself seemed to grasp this intuitively, before the psychologist even named it.
It's one of the most chilling ironies of the case. There's an account from Chief of Detectives Albert Seidman, who supposedly asked Mosley point blank how he dared to attack Kitty, and then return when there were clearly lights on and people potentially watching.
And Mosley's answer.
According to Seidman, Mosley just calmly replied, "I knew they wouldn't do anything. People never do." It's like his own predatory experience had taught him this dark truth about group inaction. He counted on it.
That's horrifying. But are there other ways to look at why people didn't intervene? Beyond just apathy or these general psychological effects?
Yeah, absolutely. Psychology has evolved since the 60s, and other perspectives add important layers. For instance, psychologist Francis Cherry brought up the lens of gender dynamics and power relations.
How does that apply here?
Well, as we touched on, the assumption that the screams might be a domestic quarrel, a man attacking his wife or girlfriend, was common. And in 1964, the social norm, unfortunately, was very much not to interfere in perceived domestic disputes. It was seen as private family business. So the inaction might have stemmed less from pure indifference and more from misclassifying the event based on ingrained social scripts about gender and relationships.
So it wasn't just, I don't care. It might have been, it's not my place to interfere if it's between a man and a woman.
Exactly. That adds a significant sociological dimension that complicates the simple apathy explanation.
Psychologists also came up with models for how we actually decide to help, didn't they? It's not just instant.
Right. Darley and Latene also propose a kind of 5-step decision-making process that has to happen for a bystander to intervene. It happens fast, often subconsciously, but each step is a potential failure point.
Okay, what are the steps?
First, you have to notice the event in the dark with city noise. Maybe you don't even register the scream clearly. Second, you have to interpret it as an emergency. That's where the domestic dispute misinterpretation comes in. Third, you have to assume responsibility. This is where diffusion of responsibility kills the impulse. Someone else will do it. Fourth, you have to know how to help. Do I call the police? Do I shout? Do I run outside? And finally, fifth, you have to actually decide to implement that help.
And all along that chain, you're weighing the risks and benefits.
Constantly. It's like a rapid internal cost-benefit analysis. What are the costs of helping? Risk of injury, getting involved with police, being late for work, emotional distress. What are the benefits? Saving someone, feeling good about yourself, social approval. If the perceived costs outweigh the perceived benefits, especially when responsibility is diffused, inaction becomes the easier path. Studies show this, like, people were way more likely to give someone money if they clearly explained they'd been robbed, defining it as an emergency, versus just vaguely asking for change. Clarity and perceived responsibility matter.
So for decades, this story, this myth, holds sway in psychology and popular culture. But then things started to shift. People started looking closer at the original reporting, at the actual facts on the ground. When did the real debunking begin?
It was a gradual process, but it really gained momentum in the 2000s. Journalists, researchers, even Katie's own brother, William Genovese, started systematically challenging the narrative.
William Genovese made a documentary, didn't he? The Witness.
Yes, in 2015, a very powerful film where he investigates his sister's murder and confronts the myths surrounding it. But even before that, academic work was picking apart the story. A really key article came out in American Psychologist in 2007.
And what did it find?
Its conclusion, later reinforced by other detailed analyses, was pretty stunning. They essentially found, quote, no evidence for the presence of 38 witnesses, or that witnesses observed the murder, or that witnesses remained inactive. The entire foundation of the legend, the 38 people watching the whole thing unfold, was basically fiction.
So how could that number, 38, be so wrong?
Yeah.
What did the investigations find about the scene itself?
Well, when you actually look at the layout of the Austin Street apartment complex in Kew Gardens, the idea of 38 people having a clear view collapses. First, remember the two stages of the attack.
Right, the parking lot, then later the hidden hallway.
Exactly. They happened in different locations, separated by about 10 minutes. Nobody saw the whole thing continuously. Second, the building itself is large, with multiple wings and courtyards. Visibility at 3:15 a.m. would have been limited. Researchers concluded the geometry made it physically impossible for 38 people to have witnessed the attack clearly.
So people might have heard things, but not seen clearly.
Precisely. Sound travels in confusing ways in urban environments. You hear a scream, maybe muffled shouts, but you can't necessarily pinpoint the source or know exactly what's happening, especially from behind closed windows in the dark.
And didn't Kitty's injuries also make the idea of continuous, loud screaming unlikely?
That's another critical forensic point. That first stab wound punctured her lung. Medical experts reviewing the case later argued that with such an injury causing rapid asphyxiation, it's highly unlikely she could have been physically capable of sustained, loud screaming during that second attack in the hallway. Any sounds then were probably much quieter, more like moans or muffled cries, which again aligns with neighbors hearing something but being unsure what it was, assuming it was a fight or people leaving the nearby bar.
Okay, so the number was wrong, the visibility was wrong. What about the most damning part of the myth that nobody called the police? Was that true?
No. That's probably the biggest distortion. Later, more careful investigation, including reviews of police records and interviews, showed that wasn't the case. Maybe about a dozen people heard or saw something, fragments of the event.
But did anyone act?
Yes. We already mentioned Robert Moser shouting from his window, which interrupted the first attack. We know another witness's father did call the police after that first attack, even if the report was downplayed or misclassified by the precinct. There's also Carl Ross, who infamously admitted calling a friend for advice before eventually calling the police, which became part of the apathy narrative. But the key thing is, multiple sources confirm at least 2 people did call the police relatively soon after the second attack concluded. The calls were made. The issue was more about the delay, the confusion, and the slow official response, not a complete failure of everyone to even pick up the phone.
And Sophia Farrar.
And Sophia Farrar, Kitty's friend, who didn't just call, she went outside into potential danger to find Kitty and comfort her in her last moments. That's direct, brave intervention, completely erased by the simplistic 38 silent witnesses story.
When you lay it all out like that, it sounds less like mass apathy and more like confusion, misinterpretation, fear, and a flawed emergency response system.
That's a much more accurate picture based on the evidence we have now.
But if the facts were so different, how did the original flawed story persist for so long? Was it just too good a story to let go?
That seems to be a huge part of it. And disturbingly, there's evidence that this wasn't just passive acceptance. There was active resistance to correcting the record, especially from those involved in the original Times story.
Really? Like who?
Well, William Genovese's documentary, The Witness, uncovered a really telling anecdote. A former WNBC police reporter named Danny Meehan claimed he realized there were major inconsistencies in the Times story almost immediately back in 1964.
What did he do?
Meehan said he spoke to Martin Gansberg, the author of the Times article, and according to Meehan, Gansberg essentially admitted that correcting the inaccuracies would have ruined the story.
Just admitted it. Sacrificing truth for narrative.
If Meehan's account is accurate, yes. And the editor, Abe Rosenthal, who championed the story, he reportedly defended it fiercely for decades. There's another story about a journalism professor whose students researched the case and found the flaws. When the professor presented the findings to Rosenthal,
How did Rosenthal react?
apparently he was furious, became irate, angrily berated the instructor for daring to question his paper's reporting. It suggests a deep institutional and personal investment in maintaining the myth, perhaps because it brought the Times so much acclaim for exposing this perceived societal ill.
So it took decades for the Times itself to acknowledge the problems.
Decades. It wasn't until 2016, 52 years after the murder, shortly after Mosley died and following years of pressure from researchers and William Genovese's film, that the New York Times finally published an editor's note. They officially called their own 1964 reporting flawed.
What did the note say specifically?
It admitted the original story grossly exaggerated the number of witnesses and what they had perceived, a major, albeit incredibly late, retraction of a story that had shaped public understanding for half a century.
Okay, so the core narrative was flawed, even actively protected despite its flaws. But the impact of that narrative, the public horror it generated, that did lead to some real positive changes, right? We shouldn't ignore that legacy.
No, absolutely not. Regardless of the factual inaccuracies of the 38 witnesses' story, the visceral public reaction was real, and it acted as a powerful catalyst for change in public safety.
Like the 9/11 system. Was Genovese really a factor there?
A primary factor. The case became Exhibit A for why the old system, calling the local precinct or dialing 0 for an operator, was dangerously inadequate for emergencies. The confusion, the delays, the lack of prioritization highlighted by Kitty's murder provided crucial political momentum for developing a single, universal, centralized emergency number. The push for 9/11, which was established nationwide starting in 1968, owes a significant debt to the public outcry over the Genovese case.
So that's a huge, tangible legacy right there.
Massive. Think how fundamental 9/11 is to our lives now. And it wasn't just 9/11, the case also fueled legal changes.
Like Good Samaritan laws.
Exactly. The fear that witnesses hesitated because they worried about legal liability if they intervened, getting involved, spurred many states to adopt Good Samaritan laws. These laws offer legal protection to people who provide reasonable help to someone they believe is injured or in danger. It was an attempt to remove a perceived barrier to helping.
And maybe more focus on victims and witnesses generally.
Yes, it contributed to a broader shift towards victim assistance programs and trying to make the process of reporting crimes and testifying less intimidating for witnesses. So, paradoxically, the flawed story generated real pressure that led to concrete improvements designed to prevent similar tragedies and encourage intervention.
But culturally, the myth itself is still incredibly powerful, isn't it? Even knowing the facts now, that image of the 38 silent witnesses persists.
Oh, it's deeply embedded. It continues to echo through popular culture, often repeating the original inaccurate version because, frankly, it's a more dramatic story. You see it referenced constantly.
In movies and TV.
All the time. There's a 1975 TV movie explicitly called Death Scream. Multiple Law & Order episodes have referenced it directly or indirectly, titles like Remand, 41 Witnesses. Characters will mention the Genovese case as shorthand for urban apathy.
And wasn't it an influence on the comic book Watchmen?
Yes, a significant one. The origin of the character Rorschach, his descent into violent vigilantism, is partly triggered by his disgust after reading about a fictionalized version of the Genovese murder and the alleged inaction of the neighbors. It taps into that same sense of moral outrage.
And in books and music, too.
Definitely. Malcolm Gladwell used the case in The Tipping Point when discussing the bystander effect, keeping it in the popular psychology conversation. And way back in 1967, folk singer Phil Ochs wrote his classic satirical song, Outside of a Small Circle of Friends.
Right, I know that one.
Yeah, each verse describes a terrible situation, including a woman screaming for help, and the narrator calmly explaining why he didn't get involved, always ending with the line, and I'm sure it wouldn't interest anybody outside of a small circle of friends. It was a direct, biting commentary on the perceived indifference highlighted by the Genovese story. The myth persists because it speaks to deep-seated fears about community, responsibility, and isolation, even if the original facts were wrong.
So bringing this all together, after digging into the crime, the myth-making, the psychology, the debunking, what's the final takeaway? When we strip away the legend, what are we left with?
I think we're left, first and foremost, with a real human tragedy. Catherine Kitty Genovese, not a symbol, not a case study number, but a 28-year-old woman with dreams saving up for that Italian restaurant whose life was violently stolen by a disturbed serial predator. That's the core truth that got lost for so long.
Right. The focus shifted from the victim and the killer to the alleged failure of the bystanders.
Exactly. And maybe the lasting lesson isn't so much about individual moral failing, although personal responsibility is always relevant. Maybe the bigger lesson is about critically examining the narratives we're given, especially those that become widely accepted truths. It's about demanding factual integrity from media, from institutions, and from ourselves. And always remembering the human beings at the center of these stories.
Questioning the easy answers, the sensational headlines.
Precisely. The Genovese case is a chilling example of how a compelling but ultimately flawed narrative can take root, shape perception for generations, and overshadow a much more complex and painful reality. And maybe, the final thought to mull over is this. How many other stories, other accepted truths that shape our understanding of history or society might also be built on shaky foundations? Myths born from media pressure or social anxiety, or just the need for a simple story to explain something complicated and awful. And what does it really take decades of work, personal crusades like William Genovese's, to finally challenge those myths and uncover the fuller, messier truth underneath?
Okay, so we hope you liked our today's discussion. For more such discussions, subscribe to our channel, Phantom Homicide.